Now that we have designed our graffiti, it is time for me to start thinking about the background. What kind of surface is my graffiti going to be on? So I'm going to use a brick wall texture or background for my graffiti design. So our first step is to, once we decide what type of surface our graffiti is applied to create that and draw that out on a piece of heavier bodied paper. So you can see here I've used a piece of tag board. It's not very thick. It's about the thickness of a manila folder, and I've drawn out my background. Now when I do this, I've applied a 1/4 inch border all the way around to help hold my design together, and I'm going to make this into a stencil. Anything that I want to have texturized or raised up on my canvas surface, I want that to become a negative space area. So you can see here where I've already started to cut out some of my brick shapes. These are going to be texturized and stand out a little bit from my canvas. To do this, I have a cutting mat down on the surface of my table. This is going to keep me from cutting my table surface. I am going to be using a X-Acto knife or craft knife while working with this to cut these shapes out. And in this particular case, our knives have a beveled edge. You can see that little bit of a lighter white line over here. That is the cutting edge. So that is the edge that's going to be facing down onto our paper. Now when I go to cut, I want to make sure my hands are clear of the blade. So if I am cutting down along here, I don't want to have my other hand across that line, because if my blade slips, I can cut my finger. So do watch your fingers and your hand placement while you're cutting this. So now that I have my work surface protected, I have my blade, I know the proper use of it, I'm ready to start cutting these pieces out. So I'm just going to, as best as I can, follow along my pencil lines and cut out the rest of my brick shapes. So that is cutting out our stencil for our background. Next, I want to add a little bit of a protectant over my template, since this is just paper. Now, this is the first time we are using this with modeling paste, so I'm not 100% sure how well this will stand up. It will at least get us one application. In the past, when I've made stencils with my students, it has been for painting. So applying something like a gel medium or any type of acrylic medium usually gives enough of a protectant to the paper itself that it can be cleaned off and reused. So we're going to go ahead and apply an acrylic medium to our stencil to hopefully give it a little bit more strength to withstand applying modeling paste over top of it to help us get our texture on our canvas. If it doesn't work, well then our stencil is only a one-time use. But if it does work, then we'll have it for future projects. So to do this, I would suggest that you take your folder and lay it down on your work surface. And I would also suggest that you get some wax paper and cover your folder with it. So you're probably going to need 2 sheets of wax paper to accommodate the width of our stencil. Once I have the wax paper laying down, I'm going to put my stencil over top, and this should help and prevent the stencil from sticking too bad to the surface it's laying on. And I'm going to use a sponge brush to coat this first side with my acrylic medium. Now I am going to apply 2 coats of this to each side. So I will have to give time for my first coat to dry. So taking a sponge brush, I'm just going to coat this first side of my stencil with the acrylic medium. Let it dry, apply a second coat, and once I have 2 coats on this side, then I'm going to flip it over and apply 2 coats to the other side. Once I am finished applying my first coat, I'm going to take this to the drying rack, let it fully dry, and apply a second coat the next day. Once I've taken this to the drying rack, then I'm going to thoroughly wash out my sponge brush and squeeze out as much water as possible and let it dry. So my first layer has dried. Before I apply the second layer on this side, I'm going to release this from the wax paper. Anything that is attached to the wax paper and pulling up with my stencil, I can clean up a little bit later before I do the back side. So for now though, I would just want to give it a release. And you can see it just pulls up off of the wax paper. I am being careful though. I'm not just pulling on one edge and ripping upwards. I am working my way around to release this from the wax paper. So these parts that are in the negative space areas, I can clean those up simply by tearing them off or using my X-Acto knife to cut those off. So those will not be a problem. But I do want to make sure this is fully released before I add another layer, because I don't want to double the thickness of the parts that are sticking to the wax paper. So now that I have it released, I'm going to apply my second coat, and I'm going to let this second coat dry just like I did the first, and then we'll move on to the back of our stencil. So that is my second layer applied. I'm going to move this over to the drying rack, and I'm going to wash my paintbrush and clean up my work area. First two coats for this side complete. So as you can see, I peeled it off of the wax paper. And before I do the back, I'm going to go ahead and tear and or trim this excess medium off of the negative space areas. So most of this will just tear off without the use of an X-Acto knife, but if you have an area in which you can't get it to peel off, then you can use the cutting mat and the X-Acto knife to clean this up. So I'm going to finish cleaning this up, and then I will be back and we'll do the back part of the stencil with the gel medium.
So I have my same sheet of wax paper that I did from before. I just flip it over because it's pretty coated with the gel medium. So I'm just going to work on the back of it. And as I demonstrated before, I'm just going to cover the entire back here with gel medium, let it dry, and then give it a second coat once it is dry. It's pretty coated with the gel medium, so I'm just going to work on the back of it. And as I demonstrated before, I'm just going to cover the entire back here with gel medium, let it dry, and then give it a second coat once it is dry. So once again, now that my first coat is on, I'm going to set this over on the drying rack, and I'm going to wash out my paintbrush and clean up my work area.
Just to save some time off camera, I removed my stencil from the wax paper, and I went ahead and trimmed up some of the extra pieces that spread over into the negative space. And I'm going to just apply my last coat on the back side of my stencil. Okay, so that is my last coat of acrylic medium. I'm going to now again put this over in the drying rack, wash out my paintbrush, and clean up my work area.